My journey basically begins with a search for the best way to learn to paint better, and this story is about meeting Ives Gammell and the path that ultimately led me to his studio. However, it would take several steps and leaps of faith in order to get to that point. First and foremost, I was very early doing drawings and paintings. From my earliest memory, that is what consumed me. I was very active in sports as well, baseball particularly, but also some boxing by junior high school. Yet the all-consuming interest was always in pictures and wanting to get much better at it. By 15, a group of us with our teacher went to the Detroit Art Institute, and it was there that I was to get the jolt I needed and wanted. There on the walls, beside many of the older masters, I found unknowns, at least by the current art standards of the postmodern era. It was work by Sargent, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and William Bouguereau that made an unmistakable impact on me. But who were they and why weren't they more known? Which seems laughable today in our modern world of the internet, etc., but these painters were the ones I needed to know better. Fast forward to my art school days. At the Society of Arts and Crafts in Detroit, I found myself reading a lot at the Detroit Public Library, which is across the avenue from the school, on these new artists and others similarly, until a guy from the school stopped me and said, "Take a look at this book on artists by someone named Gammell." He said to me, "He sounds a lot like you, about art." As I wholly rejected any notion of modern painting as art, of any credibility and its dogma right from the beginning, it was a clarion call. The book had no jacket cover, so I had no idea if the author was still around because the book was dated around 1946. But I kept checking it out from the library each month and researched the artists he wrote about, then realizing that he spoke of the decline of great painting, which I already knew, but it was the words right in the foreword that thrilled my soul. To the artist born or unborn that will lift the art of painting from the low estate from which it has fallen, this book is dedicated. So from that time, after 2.5 years at the art school, I left and began to search for a painter I could study with and really get serious. By this time, I had traveled with a friend from my art school days to New York, where we visited the Art Students League. I was not impressed with the teaching I saw there, but thought it may be the only alternative. As it happened, I was passing a newsstand in a drugstore one day, where magazines were dispersed, and as usual, I looked for art-related magazines, and saw an American Artist magazine with Bert Silverman's painting on the cover. I liked his work, so I glanced into the pages, and, lo and behold, there was a guy named Richard Lack, who was starting an atelier in Minneapolis, and actually trained with Gammell. Holy cow! Can it really be? So I immediately contacted Mr. Lack and told him I knew all about Gammell, read his book, and even hand-wrote some of the pages to always have on hand because it was out of print and no way for me to get a copy. So Lack said, "Why don't you send me samples of your work in photos, and I'll review them." By this time, I had already dozens of drawings in particular, along with a few paintings, copies of Velázquez's work, that I had photographed, then sent them to him. It was just a week or two later that I got a call from Mr. Lack that he would like me to come for a visit and see about studying. That was my turning point. I had no idea that Gammell was still very much alive in Boston, so was surprised to find it out later. Interestingly, about that time, I had already applied to the Greenshields Foundation for a grant and found that they wrote me indicating I was a finalist. After visiting Lack, I mentioned that letter to him, and he said that Gammell was instrumental in setting up the grant with Mr. Greenshields years before. Amazing coincidences. So after being accepted by Lack into the fold, we were 7 artists, and that was all he wanted at that point. With the grant monies in place, I was at least assured that that aspect was in place during my years at Lack's Atelier. Now, our routine at Lack's Atelier was a replica of the French école system, as we all pretty much know about today, but was very new to me and the others in those early days. So the very start was, of course, cast drawing for a few months. Lack had instructed me to put away my paints for now, till the eye is sufficiently trained, I had the opportunity to work personally at Lac's atelier home alongside him at the end of the room as he painted a large canvas. This was so he could check on my drawing at regular intervals. The other artists were at the school doing similar work, and after a few months, all of us worked from the figure and began doing still life work for shapes and design elements in picture making. And as time went on, we began to paint portrait heads, then the figure in oils, while some continued in charcoal. During that period, some of the students had already spent some brief time with Gammell in Boston, so there were many humorous stories of his mannerisms, toughness, but also deep respect for his training. It should be pointed out that Mr. Gammell, as they related about him, was very strict in many ways, so some students would break over this taskmaster's ways. But as my training at Lac's atelier was reaching an end, about 3+ years, I relocated to Sandusky, Ohio to live and began to do a little teaching and started portrait painting, and at the same time looked for galleries that would be useful. It was while securing a gallery in Medina, Ohio called Gallery Blue that I met fellow artist Charles Pfahl. He was back and forth to New York and we got along. Eventually he suggested why not think about a move to New York and use his loft studio to get started. I was very anxious at that point to make the move anyway, so I arranged the time. It was during the Memorial Day weekend of 1976. At Charles's studio, while he was at another location working on another project, I thought to myself perhaps I should give Mr. Gammell a call. That would change my life. During my phone call to Mr. Gammell from the studio in New York City, I was surprised and excited that it was Gammell himself who answered the phone. I had heard that Gammell always had people around him, both students and a chauffeur, so I assumed he may have someone else pick up the phone to talk. In any event, I was thrilled to actually hear his voice, and I quickly introduced myself, mentioning my time at Richard Lac's atelier and a bit more of my background in brief, to which he said, "Come to Boston, I would like to see you at Fenway Studios." He said to be there at 9:30 on Monday. My first seeing Gammell as I pulled up in my car was when he was getting out of his car in front of the Fenway studio building, driven by his assistant, and yes, the clouds separated as the light shone about the whole building, or so it seemed. Once my appointed time was met, I entered the Fenway studio that Gammell used. He greeted me at the door very cordially and beckoned me to enter and sit to chat. I brought a portrait of the young girl to show him, and he looked it over and after a short time said, "I would like you to come to Williamstown to study over the summer." Gammell had a group of studios near his own and where his residence was attached. So from that initial meeting I decided to return home, get my things in order, and ready myself for the summer workshop. Because I knew the importance of this time, I bought a fresh notebook, put together my paint box, colors, and clothes to be ready by July to get started. Our schedule was very strict, and there were 4 other students working with him as well. They had been with him for several years already, and at his beck and call. We were to meet each morning at 8:45 a.m., not later, 6 days a week. I was given an adjacent studio to myself of the 2 he had for visiting students. In addition, it was equipped with sleeping quarters, sort of like a mother-in-law suite, attached to his residence. But I was told to room at Mrs. Lally's boarding house not far from the studios. She often hosted Gammell's overflow of pupils when needed. I settled in, and the fellows educated me on what Gammell expected, a sort of rules to honor around Mr. Gammell. His estate encompassed some 40 acres and was surrounded by trees. Gammell was an avid bird watcher with binoculars, so he walked the grounds into the woods often. I would later help build some footbridges over crevasses with small fallen tree limbs, for which he paid me, but only after hours, or on Sunday, when not in the studio. His generous fee was to help my expenses while studying. Our general work schedule was mornings devoted to portrait work, and the afternoons for landscape painting. The landscape exercises were called 5-finger exercises, on prepared charcoal paper, sized with shellac in order to accommodate the oils. Each paper was cut into 10 by 12-inch sheets, and he gave us the outdoor palette colors he recommended to use. My first model was a young girl named Laurie. She often earned from sitting for the students, and I was happy to get started. Her portrait turned out well, but as I finished it, her parents wanted to buy the portrait, so I sold it to them for around $35. Unfortunately, I did not photograph the work, and am sorry I didn't think of it at that time. Hopefully, it will show up at some garage sale so I can buy it back. After that Head and Shoulders portrait, I began work on a larger portrait of an elder gentleman named Bernie. He roomed across the hall from my room at Mrs. Lally's, and he had a taxidermy shop. We became close friends thereafter. I did a few interior paintings of his shop with all the animals there as well. But over the years they have since disappeared. I trust someone has them safe somewhere. In any event, my time with Gammell was chock full each day. On Sundays, I traveled with a couple of the guys to museums in the area. The Clark Institute of Art was nearby Gammell's studio, so I went there regularly over lunchtime to study. I am a museum aficionado, and besides it hosted works by John Sargent, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and of course the great Nymphs and Satyr by Bouguereau, an absolute masterpiece. Gammell critiqued our work as needed, at least once a day. He used his standing stool, as he called it, his equalizer, because Gammell was rather short of stature and all the guys were well over 6 feet. As he stood across the room beside us, he stood on the equalizer and held onto our arm to steady himself. We worked sight-size, and Gammell would talk at each visit continually, and we hung on each word, never interrupting. I had my notebook always at the ready, each day, and made a regular point to knock at his studio door to ask questions about procedures or concepts or anything relevant to our painting. Gammell did not suffer fools with trite questions, and could fly off the handle with high-pitched verbiage at his displeasure, so all was very orderly at the compound. But having said that, Gammell was also very generous and cared that we do well. On one occasion, I remember wanting to ask him about the flatness component in picture making, and he said, "Come in and remain quiet. Sit there until I finish this," some writing he was doing. And he gave me over an hour of instruction on that topic and related items, including his time with Sergeant Kendall, his first important teacher. John Sargent was also a common topic, where he relates his visit with Sargent at a dinner party and what he thought of William Paxton's work, who Gammell had been working under, to which Sargent replied, "He draws quite well," and Gammell, enamored by Sargent, was otherwise at a loss for words. Gammell's stories, his times with Decamp as well as Paxton, but also his thoughts on the Boston Impressionists were as from a time capsule, their peccadillos, personalities, and working habits, both good and bad. For example, he stated that Decamp might throw a different color over an area than what was actually there, but Gammell was a purist and said he opposed that idea in general. He said Benson was a rather poor draftsman, while about others, some very shy, others quite well educated, and still others lost their way as painters, etc. But it was the story he related to me that stuck out rather poignantly as I walked with him outside the studio and stuck with me over the years. He related that he had hoped to have a student with a similar education and background with whom he could relate, well-bred, if you will. It was something I never forgot until years later, when he wrote about regretting not having a chance to study with Pierre Laurent, the younger son of the great Jean-Paul Laurent at Académie Julien's. It was fellow students who prompted Gammell when he was studying in France, and recommended he join them at another atelier, and persuaded him to follow. Lawrence had that same pedigree as Gammell that he admired. It was a decision he wished could have been, but wasn't to be. Back to my portrait of Bernie. Gammell was very adamant to be sure to carefully design each aspect with due care and attention. First, I was to do a full-size charcoal for the general lay-in. Then, when complete, transfer to canvas. As I began to develop the portrait in oils, Gammell would come in with his suggestions or actually paint some part of the picture as he thought could be improved. It was my eagerness to work the face really well that I spent too much time on it, and the back stragglers in the picture were not up to speed. So one day he came in, and with a brush full of paint, wiped out the head of Bernie and said, "Now get that zipper better designed." This happened about 5 times, till I fully got the zipper to his satisfaction, although tough to learn, but well learned nonetheless. Yet his compliment was that I caught the character of Bernie very well, and oddly enough his expression was a bit sad, in that he lost his son in an accident during this period, and I evidently picked up on that as he sat for me and asked, "Try not to show my sadness." On another Saturday, there was to be a couple of attorneys who wanted to ask Gammell's opinion of a Dennis Bunker landscape they had tucked away in some attic and needed an appraisal. Gammell guessed the work to be around $30,000, which they bought it for just the frame at $35. Afterward, Gammell told them to get it repaired by his restorer, as it was ripped across the bottom. Gammell was really pissed at that. They asked to have a photo with him. He said, "No, get out, I'm busy." Gammell generally did not permit photos of him, yet he allowed me to do so, which I am still grateful. So many of these would never have been seen had I not been able to. Leaving Gammell, I was soon to be returning home to put into practice his methods. By September, his routine was to close up his Williamstown studio for winter and return back to Fenway in Boston. In general, the best way to describe Gammell's approach was to use paint with only a few drops of linseed oil on the palette. This was strictly adhered to, then a retouch varnish between coats as needed. Richard Lack, on the other hand, was okay with some experimenting, generally with poppy oil and or Taubes copal varnish. So for you artists out there you go. In the years that followed, I traveled quite a lot and was interested in my own favorite painters, to include Bastien Lepage and Henri Regnault, and the English painters of the Newland School, or group, if you will. So traveling to the UK and France several times aided my search as to their techniques and seeing the work firsthand. Russia was included in my travels, by invitation, and then ultimately I moved from Ohio to New York for about 3 years, and finally to Florida for serious plein air figure work. So, to put it all in full circle, I was to meet again with Mr. Gammell in Boston just a couple of weeks before his passing in 1981. He was thrilled to know I was actively trying to make an impact on his legacy and training, and brought with me Fred Ross, who would later form the ARC website for artists as his contribution to the overall movement. It would be well along and gradually that more and more artists would receive training once again, spread out across the globe, study the figure seriously, and start to use the very principles that Gammell sought to make happen and fostered. His legacy is sure, and I was honored to be a part. Now let's take a better look at some of Gammell's work. Gladly, some of his works are being rediscovered in recent times. His portrait work was very thorough and always with a good sense of design. He was a big fan of the writings of Carl Jung and looked to paint pictures around his philosophy and ideas. This is often important for artists as they become better technically, to find a niche in order to be excited at each new day in the studio. Gammell's real success was in his ability to overcome the clear obstacles occurring during the rapid decline of art knowledge that had been so skillfully blossoming in the French atelier system, a system the whole world sought at the dawn of the 19th century. Coming from a prominent banking family, he chose the path of the arts that he was passionate about. His parents, the subject of portraits by the most notable artists of the day, J. Shannon and William Sargent Kendall, and Joseph de Camp, the family friend and his artistic mentor, would lead Gammell to the right path and course of his chosen study. He was provided 1 year to test his abilities while forgoing Harvard, wherein the youthful Gammell, with de Camp's direction, would prove successful toward pursuing art as a vocation. This would also be a defining moment in art history because his passion turned into a quest. Gammell, with tenacity and purpose, kept the precepts alive in his own work and well understood the standards every great painter must reach for. The book Twilight of Painting by Gammell would be the clarion call to awaken the need for sound training and lift a great need into the reality that would change the world of art. In that vein, I much later transcribed my own notes from Mr. Gammell's teaching in 1976 and published Inside the Studio of R.H. Ives Gammell. It is a look into the wonderful working world artists seek in the studio to reach for the very heights of artistic expression while maintaining time-tested work ethics and imagination. In honor of R.H. Ives Gammell, visionary artist, keeper of tradition, and master of timeless beauty, his work endures, a testament to truth in art and the soul's pursuit of excellence.